Okay, so imagine for a second that a country, it's not a landmass or a flag or, a seat at the UN. Imagine it's a patient, a living, breathing organism walking into a doctor's office for a really high-stakes checkup. It sits on that crinkly paper, maybe looking a little pale, and the doctor starts checking the vitals.
It's a really compelling way to frame it. We're so used to talking about nations in terms of, GDP or election results, these very abstract, cold numbers. But when you see it as a body with a metabolism, with nervous system failures, with chronic pain, it just changes how you understand the problems. It makes them feel immediate.
Exactly. And that's pretty much what we're doing today. We're not looking at a news report. We're looking at a medical file.
Yeah.
We got a document here. It's titled, Perform a Professional Diagnosis of the Republic of Macedonia. It's by a Dr. Luben Diasporov, dated early 2026. So this is a very fresh chart, and the diagnosis right at the top of the file. Well, it's heavy.
It is. It's complex. And just to orient everyone, the patient here is the Republic of Macedonia, which, of course, is formerly known as North Macedonia since the Prespa Agreement back in 2018.
Right. And Dr. Diasporov, he doesn't pull any punches. He sums up the country's condition with a phrase that's been rattling around in my head all morning: developmental purgatory.
That's a very specific choice of words. Purgatory.
It sounds almost theological.
It does, but think about what it means mechanically. Purgatory isn't hell, right? The country isn't collapsing. There's no war. The supermarkets are full. But it's not heaven either. It hasn't reached that European standard of living that's been promised for so long. It's a state of waiting. The core thesis here is that the patient has the roadmap. It knows exactly where to go, but it lacks the internal velocity to actually move.
It's like you're sitting in a car, you've got Brussels plugged into the GPS, but the transmission is just stuck in neutral. You can rev the engine all you want, but the car isn't moving an inch.
That is the exact feeling of stasis that this report gets at.
So our mission on this deep dive is to unpack this medical chart. We're going to look at the country through the three lenses the doctor proposes: geopolitical trajectory, economic resilience, and systemic integrity.
Yeah, you can think of them as the cardiovascular system, the metabolism, and the nervous system. And as any doctor knows, if one fails, the whole body starts shutting down.
Okay, let's start with that first one, geopolitical trajectory. The diagnosis here is systemic stasis.
Okay.
Now, I want to push back on that a little bit, because looking at the chart for early 2026, on paper, the patient looks fine. They're a NATO member. They're firmly aligned with the West. Why stasis?
That's a fair question. On the surface, NATO membership is a security umbrella. That's the stable part of the chart. The patient isn't in, immediate danger. But the report highlights this massive internal friction that's basically canceling out that external stability. Dr. Diasporov calls it the institutional glass ceiling.
Glass ceiling. We usually hear that in a corporate context for minorities or women. How does that apply to a whole country?
In this case, it refers to European Union accession. That's the big prize, right?
Yeah.
Joining the single market. But the report notes that even though negotiations are technically open, progress is, for all intents and purposes, frozen. It's a waiting room effect. And there's a very specific, very thorny reason for that mentioned here: the French proposal.
Okay, we need to really get into this. The French proposal. This has been in the headlines for a while. What is the actual mechanical blockage?
It boils down to identity and the Constitution. The proposal, which is the main condition for moving forward with the EU, requires North Macedonia to amend its constitution to explicitly list Bulgarians as a constituent people.
To an outsider, that just sounds administrative. Like, just add a line of text. Why is that such a huge roadblock?
It sounds administrative to us, but on the ground, it is explosive. It touches on these deep historical wounds, on politics around language and identity between North Macedonia and Bulgaria. The report calls it a polarizing domestic hurdle.
So the EU is saying, change your constitution, then you can move forward. But the parliament, at least as of early 2026, doesn't have the votes to do it.
Precisely. And because they haven't cleared that one bar, the entire accession process is just paused. The engine is off. And here's the psychological impact the report really emphasizes. If you're a reformer in the government or a business owner and you feel like the goalposts just keep moving, your motivation to do the hard work just evaporates.
It's reform fatigue.
Yeah.
Why would you scrub the floors and paint the walls if the landlord is never going to let you open for business?
Exactly. And the report also flags geopolitical vetoes as a persistent risk. It's rated medium severity, but the impact is high. The country doesn't fully control its own destiny. Neighbors like Bulgaria and Greece in the past, they hold these on-off switches
And they can just flick the switch to off at any time.
and leave North Macedonia in the dark.
Which brings us to the internal health of the patient. If the outside world is stuck, what's going on inside the body? And this is where the diagnosis gets, a lot darker. Let's talk symptoms, specifically corruption.
This is the section that really seems to worry the doctor. The report cites a statistic that is, frankly, staggering. 77% of citizens view corruption as a way for elites to get rich.
77%.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not a fringe belief, that's the national consensus.
It is. But I want to zoom in on something really nuanced that the analysis points out. It's not just that people think corruption exists, it's that public tolerance for bribery is going up.
Wait, that seems backwards. If 77% of people hate it and think it's just for the rich, why would tolerance for it be rising?
Because the psychology has shifted. The report argues that citizens have stopped viewing bribery as a moral failure. They now see it as a survival strategy.
A survival strategy. Break that down for me.
Okay, imagine you need a permit for a small shop. Or you need to get your sick parent an appointment at the state hospital. The official channel, the official line is 3 months long. Or the paperwork just sits on a desk. The system is clogged.
Right, classic bureaucracy.
But if you slip an envelope with, say, 500 euros to the right person, the permit is stamped today. The appointment is tomorrow. In that context, the bribe stops feeling like a crime in your mind. It becomes a toll fee. It's just the cost of bypassing a broken system.
Wow. That is a dangerous feedback loop. Because if you accept the disease as the only way to function, you never try to cure it. You budget for it.
That's it. The report calls it normalization due to lack of alternatives. It just eats away at the social contract. People stop trusting the state because the only way the state works is if you pay extra.
And speaking of paying, let's look at the government's own finances. If the people are paying bribes to get by, what does the national budget look like? This is that economic resilience lens.
The diagnosis for the 2026 budget is fiscal fragility. And the report explicitly describes the budget strategy as security over welfare.
Security over welfare. That sounds like a country on a wartime footing.
In a way, it is. Military spending is up, mostly to meet those NATO obligations we talked about. That's the security part. But the trade-off is, it's stark. The report notes that only about 10% of the entire $7 billion budget is actually going to capital investments.
And let's just clarify what capital investments are for everyone listening. We're talking about things that build future value, right?
Exactly. New highways, updating the energy grid, modernizing schools, the stuff that grows the economy 10 years from now.
And only 10% of the money is going there, so where's the other 90% going?
Salaries for public employees, pensions, operational costs, and debt. This is the flashing red light on the dashboard. Public debt is hovering right around 60% of GDP.
Okay, to play devil's advocate for a second, 60% isn't, catastrophic compared to Italy or the US.
Yeah.
Why is a doctor so worried about 60%?
True, the headline number itself isn't the problem. The problem is the cost of that debt. The report points out that interest payments have doubled in the last 5 years.
Doubled. So your mortgage payment just went up 100%.
Correct. And this creates something economists call crowding out. Think about your own budget. If your income is fixed, but your credit card minimum payment doubles, that is money you can no longer spend on groceries or anything else.
So the government literally can't afford to invest in its own people because it's too busy paying for the past.
Precisely. It kills any fiscal space for growth. The government is paralyzed by its own bills.
And what about the people? Let's talk about the human cost here. Because you can look at spreadsheets all day, but what does the patient's face look like? The report lists demographic drain as a high-severity risk.
This is the brain drain. It's the story of the entire Western Balkans, really. Young, talented professionals, engineers, doctors, IT specialists, they're packing their bags and moving to Germany, to Austria, wherever they can in the EU.
And the report says this is eroding the future tax base, which just makes that debt problem even worse, right? Fewer people left to pay the bills.
It's a vicious cycle. You lose the talent, you lose the innovation, and you lose the tax revenue to pay for everything else.
Yeah.
But there was another statistic in this section that I found even more, shocking. Energy poverty.
Yeah, that one jumped out at me too. The report says approximately 24% of households face energy poverty.
24%. Compare that to the EU average, which is around 7.5%. It's more than triple.
So practically speaking, what does that look like for 1 out of every 4 families?
It means choosing between heating your home in the winter and buying quality food. It means keeping the lights off to save money. It means a huge part of your income money that should be going to local shops and cafes is just vanishing into a utility bill.
So it's a massive drag on the entire local economy. If no one has spare cash, no local businesses can grow. Exactly, and this goes right back to that security over welfare budget. The state hasn't invested enough in domestic energy, so they're reliant on expensive imports, and the regular citizen pays the price.
And on top of all that, if you're a foreign company looking at this patient thinking, maybe I should invest, you run into the judicial system. The report rates judicial credibility as critical low.
Critical low. That is the absolute bottom of the scale. And the report explicitly links this to the lack of foreign direct investment.
Because if I'm going to build a factory there and someone breaks a contract, I need to know a court will back me up.
And if you think the judge is just going to rule for whoever paid the biggest survival strategy bribe, you don't build the factory. You go next door where the courts are predictable.
So the country loses jobs, loses capital, not because it's not talented, but because it lacks systemic integrity.
Okay, let's just pause here and look at the patient. We've got geopolitical stasis, a glass ceiling on EU growth, high blood pressure from debt, a chronic infection of corruption. And the healthy cells, the young people, are leaving. It sounds, well, terminal.
It sounds incredibly grim, yes. But Dr. Diasporov doesn't just list the problems. This isn't an autopsy, it's a diagnosis. And with a diagnosis comes a treatment plan.
Right, a path from stasis to convergence. He breaks it into phases. Let's look at phase I, institutional surgery.
The word surgery is very intentional. This isn't about taking a vitamin. This is about cutting something out. The first step is that constitutional resolution we talked about, getting all the parties to agree on the Bulgarian amendment.
Basically, swallow the bitter pill to get that EU engine turned back on.
The report is very clear. Without this, nothing else really matters. You can't treat the rest of the body if the heart isn't beating.
And the second part of the surgery is judicial decoupling. This is about the State Commission for Prevention of Corruption, the SCPC. The plan calls for giving them actual prosecutorial teeth.
Teeth. I like that. So
Yeah.
moving them from a watchdog that just barks to one that actually bites.
Exactly. Right now, they can write a report saying, hey, this public official looks corrupt, and the official can often just shrug it off. The plan is to give them the power to initiate prosecution themselves. That changes the whole risk calculation for being corrupt.
Okay, then phase 2 is economic rewiring. This is the 12 to 24-month plan.
Right. This is where you try to fix the country's metabolism. The goal is to pivot from just maintaining the status quo with pensions and salaries to actual productive investment. The report specifically mentions leveraging the new EU growth plan for the Western Balkans.
And there's a specific technical fix mentioned here that I want to unpack. Beneficial ownership. That sounds like jargon. Why does it matter so much?
It's actually one of the most powerful anti-corruption tools there is. Beneficial ownership just means knowing who actually owns a company behind all the shell corporations and paperwork.
Give me a real-world example.
Okay, so the government puts out a tender to build a new road. A company bids for the contract. On paper, it's owned by some generic entity in an offshore haven. But with beneficial ownership transparency, you could see that the actual human being who owns that company is the cousin of the Minister of Transport.
Sunlight.
Exactly. If the registry is open and machine-readable, journalists and watchdogs can connect those dots instantly. It makes it much harder for shell companies to win government contracts.
But there's a warning in this section too. A shock to the system coming in October 2026, this mandatory e-invoicing rollout.
Yeah, the report calls this a massive shock for small businesses. E-invoicing means every single transaction is digitally recorded and sent to the tax authority in real time.
So no more cash under the table. No more, I'll give you a discount if we don't do a receipt.
Precisely. It forces the gray economy into the light. Now, it's painful for businesses that operate on those thin, tax-dodging margins to survive, but it's essential for fixing that fiscal fragility we talked about. You have to capture the revenue.
And then we have phase 3, human capital. This is the long game. How do you keep the young people from leaving?
The suggestion is vocational reform, but not just any job training. The report is specific. Align education with the green transition and digital services. It actually calls out online gaming and tech sectors as huge growth areas.
That's interesting. So it's not just about factories. It's about acknowledging the future is digital.
And alongside that, to fix the energy poverty, the plan is to aggressively subsidize residential solar panels. If you can't lower the price of imported energy, help people generate their own. It tackles the poverty issue and the environmental issue at the same time.
Now, before we get to the final verdict, I have to bring up something really unusual in this source. It feels like a record scratch in the middle of a song.
You must be talking about the alternative path.
Yeah. I mean, we spent this whole time talking about NATO, the EU, Western alignment, and then tucked away in the action plan, there's just one line. Consider joining BRICS. Return official name and flag.
It stops you in your tracks, doesn't it?
It does. BRICS the bloc with Brazil, Russia, India, China. That's the geopolitical polar opposite of the EU. And return official name? That's reversing the PRESPA agreement. That's undoing a decade of diplomacy. Why is this even in the chart?
We have to just view this neutrally as a data point. What it shows is the depth of the frustration. The fact that a professional diagnosis would even list this as a possibility is a huge signal. It suggests that if the Western path stays blocked, if that glass ceiling doesn't break, then the pressure to find any alternative, any other door is going to grow.
It's the flight in fight or flight. If the door to the West is locked, do you just stand in the hallway forever, or you start looking for another exit?
Exactly. It underscores the urgency. It's a warning shot to Brussels as much as it is to Skopje. The status quo of just waiting around isn't sustainable. Eventually, the patient will seek a second opinion.
So after all this, what is the final verdict? What is Dr. Diasporov's prognosis for this patient?
He classifies Macedonia as a moderately free economy, but the summary is piercing. He says the country is over-leveraged on geopolitical promises and underperforming on domestic governance.
Overpromised and underdelivered.
And the ultimate risk isn't some dramatic collapse. We think of failed states as, explosions and anarchy. The risk here is quieter and maybe even sadder. It's irrelevance.
Irrelevance.
The report warns that the country is on a path to becoming a hollowed-out state of pensioners and civil servants by 2028 if these trends aren't reversed.
That is a haunting image. A country where the only people left are the ones being paid by the state or the ones retired from it. No vibrant private sector, no young innovators, just a slow fade.
That is the very definition of the developmental purgatory we started with. It's a stable, slow decline, and that's why the institutional surgery is so urgent. You can't just wait this out. It needs a real intervention.
So to recap the chart, we have a patient, North Macedonia, in early 2026. It has the potential. It has the roadmap to health. But the main door, the EU door, is jammed. The internal organs are stressed by corruption and debt. And the lifeblood, the young talent, is leaving.
But the treatment plan is there. It involves painful political surgery, giving the anti-corruption cops real teeth, and a kind of shock therapy of transparency for the economy. It's all doable, but it requires a level of political bravery that has, so far, been missing.
It reminds me of one of those patients who knows they need to quit smoking and start exercising, but they just don't, because the survival strategy of staying the same is easier in the short term.
And when the whole system seems to incentivize you to stay sick, that's the hardest habit of all to break.
This deep dive really shows how fragile the idea of progress can be. We get fixated on the big summits and the handshake photos, but the real story of a nation is in the plumbing. It's in the budget lines, the court rulings, the energy bills.
Absolutely. That's where a nation lives or dies.
And that brings us to the end of our shift on this diagnosis. But before you go, I want to leave you with a thought to mull over. We talk about corruption becoming a survival strategy.
Mm-hmm.
If a system is so broken that doing the wrong thing is the only way for most people to survive, at what point does the system itself become the enemy of its own citizens?
And to add to that, can a hollowed-out state ever truly be refilled? Once the talent is gone, does it ever really come back?
Something to think about. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
Stay curious.
See you next time.